Some decisions look like mistakes from the outside. From the inside, they feel like the only honest thing a man has left. Grady Mercer understood that truth on a Tuesday night in late October, standing in his kitchen with a phone in one hand and $17 of breathing room between himself and complete collapse. The apartment above the Suds and Spin laundromat on East Walnut Street was not a home. It was a waiting room, a place where a man marked time between the life he used to have and whatever came next, if anything came next at all. The walls were thin enough to hear Mrs. Holbert's television through the drywall every single night. Game shows, the kind with bright lights and cheerful hosts who acted like winning a refrigerator, was the greatest thing that could happen to a human being. Grady had stopped hearing it months ago, the same way he'd stopped smelling the detergent and hot lint that rose through the floorboards like a permanent fog. You didn't stop noticing those things because they went away. You stopped noticing them because your mind decided that survival required a certain amount of selective blindness, and his mind had gotten very good at that particular skill over the past 14 months. He was 53 years old. His hands told the whole story better than any resume ever could. Knuckles scarred from stripped bolts, palms thick as boot leather from 3 decades of gripping wrenches, and his right pinky finger crooked at the second joint where a transmission housing had crushed it back in 2001 and the small-town urgent care had set it wrong. Those hands had rebuilt engines that other mechanics had given up on. Those hands had signed divorce papers 14 months ago that cost him nearly everything he'd spent 20 years building. The apartment reflected what remained after the accounting was done. A couch pulled from a neighbor's curb, its cushions compressed into something that approximated comfort without fully achieving it. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, one of them repaired twice with wood glue, and a prayer. A mattress on the floor in the bedroom because the bed frame had gone to a storage unit he could no longer afford to pay for. He'd stopped going to retrieve things from that storage unit. Whatever was in there was gone now in every meaningful sense, even if it still technically existed. And in the second bedroom, barely larger than a walk-in closet, twin bed from Goodwill that waited for Owen. Owen Mercer was 16. He was tall the way teenage boys get when growth outpaces everything else, all angles and sharp edges, not quite fitting inside his own skin yet. He had his mother's dark eyes and Grady's stubborn jawline, and lately he wore his feelings the way a soldier wears body armor. Tight shoulders, clipped answers. Eyes that looked past Grady rather than at him, as if the middle distance contained something more reliable than his father's face. The armor wasn't cruelty. Grady understood that. It was protection. The boy had been pulled in 2 directions for 2 years and had learned that the safest place was the space between where neither parent could quite reach him. The custody arrangement was 8 months old. Grady had won it technically after 2 years of legal proceedings that consumed $43,000 he didn't have and left him taking out loans against his truck and selling things in a specific order that he tried not to think about too carefully. He'd sold his professional-grade tool set, first the one he'd built over 15 years buying one piece at a time when he could afford it. Then he'd bought cheaper replacements. Then he'd sold those too and bought the cheapest set that would still let him do the work. By the time the judge signed the custody agreement, Grady Mercer had $517 in his checking account and a teenage son who barely spoke to him. Winning had never felt less like victory. He'd worked at Kellerman Auto on the corner of Maple and 9th for 17 years. Steady work, honest work. The kind of shop where the owner, Bill Kellerman, was a fair man who paid on time and asked no questions when Grady needed time off for court dates and quietly rearranged the schedule to give him the better-paying jobs whenever possible. He understood what Grady was going through without requiring it to be explained, which was the most valuable kind of understanding available to a man in that situation. His coworker Darnell, who worked the bay beside his, had been a reliable presence through all of it. Not intrusive, just there. The way men support each other when words feel inadequate and actions need to be small enough not to embarrass anyone. A 6-pack left in the cab of Grady's truck on a Friday afternoon. Help moving boxes into the apartment that one awful Saturday in September. Silence when silence was the right language, which was most of the time. Grady had just come home from a 10-hour shift. His back ached from leaning over an engine block all afternoon, the specific ache of a man whose body has been doing the same physical work for so long that it no longer complains loudly, just maintains a steady, low-level commentary about the cost of everything. His hands still smelled like brake fluid, despite washing them 3 times at the shop sink. He'd stopped at the gas station for a sandwich and a coffee that tasted like burned cardboard. And now he stood in his kitchen, eating standing up because sitting down required a decision he didn't have the energy to make, looking at the small spiral notebook he kept beside the coffee maker. He tracked every dollar in that notebook, not because he was organized by nature, but because he couldn't afford not to be. The numbers were written in his mechanic's hand, block letters and clean columns, the handwriting of a man who had learned that precision in small things was the only defense against larger failures. Rent, $650, due in 9 days. Groceries needed, gas low. Checking account, $517. He was doing the math for the 3rd time as if repetition might change the outcome when his phone buzzed against the counter. Sylvia's name on the screen made his stomach tighten the way it always did. That specific contraction of muscle that his body had learned over 14 years of marriage and 14 months of divorce, a Pavlovian response to a particular combination of syllables that he suspected would never fully go away. He stared at the name for 2 full rings, then answered because ignoring Sylvia had never once made anything easier. It had only ever postponed things, and postponed things had a way of arriving worse than they would have if he'd just dealt with them immediately. Grady, her voice was clipped, efficient. She had perfected that tone during the divorce proceedings, the voice of a woman conducting business rather than having a conversation, and she had never fully put it down afterward. Sylvia, what do you need? Owen needs winter clothes, boots a proper coat, thermal layers. What he has doesn't fit anymore. He's been growing. Grady leaned against the counter and closed his eyes for a moment. I bought him clothes 6 weeks ago. He's 16, that's what 16-year-olds do. They grow. A pause, deliberate. Then her voice shifted into what Grady privately called her reasonable tone, the one she deployed when she was building towards something and wanted you to feel like you were the unreasonable party when you resisted. Look, I know money is tight right now. I'm not trying to make this difficult. If you could send me $500, I'll handle everything he needs. Consider it your contribution. $500. Grady opened his eyes and looked at the notebook. After rent, he would have $67. $67 for 2 weeks of food, gas, and every emergency that might arise between now and his next paycheck. The math didn't require a notebook. It barely required a brain. It was just a number sitting in the air between him and everything else. That's not how the custody agreement works, Sylvia. I provide for him here. You provide for him there. You provide for him in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Her voice was still reasonable, but something had sharpened underneath it. He sleeps in a room the size of a storage closet, Grady. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm describing the situation as it exists. I'm managing fine. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you spent 2 years and $40,000 winning a custody battle you can't afford to follow through on. A pause that felt calculated, the pause of someone who has rehearsed this moment. My brother has been looking into some things. He thinks we may have grounds to request a modification based on inadequate housing. Grady's jaw tightened. Douglas. It was always Douglas lately running in the background of everything. We're not revisiting the custody agreement. Then show me you can actually provide for our son. $500, Grady, for Owen. She let the name sit there for a moment, using their son as punctuation the way she always had when she wanted to end a discussion rather than continue it. I'll be in touch. She ended the call. Grady stood in his kitchen, holding his dead phone, feeling the familiar weight of everything pressing down, at once the specific gravity of a man who is tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Through Owen's bedroom door, he could see the thin line of light from the boy's phone. Music playing at low volume, the bass coming through the wall as a feeling rather than a sound. His son right there 10 feet away, close enough to knock on a door and reach impossibly distant in every way that mattered. He set his phone down, opened his laptop. The machine took nearly 3 minutes to boot up, which gave him time to breathe and think and not make any decisions he'd regret. He told himself he was just looking, checking apartment listings in the cheaper parts of town. Maybe something with 2 real bedrooms, a little more space, a little more room to be a father without bumping into the walls of the attempt. He scrolled through listings, too far from Owen's school, too expensive for what it offered. One that looked promising until he read the reviews mentioning the mold problem and the landlord who had a policy of never answering calls after 6 in the evening or before 10 in the morning, which described most of the hours when problems actually occurred. He wasn't sure exactly when he navigated away from apartments to the foreclosure and auction section of the county property database. He'd looked at it before, once or twice late at night after Owen was asleep, the way a man looks at something impossible, just to remind himself that the world still contains possibilities beyond the ones currently available to him. Foreclosed houses, properties sold as is for prices that seemed like printing mirrors, dreams that had gone wrong and been reduced to line items in a bank's ledger. Most were ruins in towns too small to have a gas station. Most were problems wearing the disguise of opportunities. Then he saw it. 2241 Harlow Creek Road, Brown County, Indiana. Cash auction. Minimum bid $500. He clicked through to the listing. The photos loaded slowly on his old machine, each one appearing in sections from the top down. A two-story structure that had clearly been something once before time and abandonment had their way with it. White paint, or what remained of it, peeling away to expose gray clapboard, weathered to the color of old bone. Windows broken or boarded. A front porch that sagged in the middle, with a dramatic resignation like something that had been holding itself up through sheer stubbornness and had finally, after years of effort, run out. Ivy consumed the entire right side of the building, thick ropey vines that had worked their way under the siding and probably into the walls themselves, reclaiming territory the way nature always eventually does. The description was minimal. Foreclosed property sold as is. Structure requires significant repair. 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, approximately 1,400 square feet. 3 acres, cash only, no inspections, no warranties, minimum bid $500. Grady zoomed in on the photographs, looking past the damage to what lay beneath it. He'd spent 17 years reading engines, learning to see not just what was broken, but what was worth saving, which were different questions that required different kinds of attention. He knew the difference between damage that was cosmetic and damage that was structural, between a problem that would yield to work and one that would only consume more work, until you had to accept that some things couldn't be saved. The house had a roof line that suggested solid, original framing. The foundation stones visible in one corner photo looked intact, set in the way they built them in the 1920s, when people expected things to last. The chimney rising through the center of the structure showed no obvious lean or separation. The porch was rotten, but porches could be rebuilt. Windows could be replaced. Ivy could be pulled. None of those were structural failures. They were the accumulated damage of neglect, which was a very different category of problem. The bones looked good. He sat back and looked at his notebook. $517. Rent or a house, safety or a gamble. He thought about Owen in that closet-sized room. He thought about $17 after rent and what $17 actually meant in practice in the grocery store, at the gas pump, in every ordinary transaction that stood between a man and the basics of functioning. He thought about the next 2 years trying to convince a 16-year-old that his father's apartment above a laundromat was a home worth belonging to, worth defending against his mother's arguments, worth choosing, when the alternative was a house with a guest room and a neighborhood and the appearance of stability. He thought about the judge who had looked at him across a courtroom 8 months ago and decided he was worth believing. He thought about what it would mean to build something, not rent something, not survive in something temporarily while waiting for circumstances to improve. Build something, with his hands over time in the way that things built by hand take on the character of the person who built them. At 12:47 in the morning, Grady Mercer filled out the online bid form for 2241 Harlow Creek Road. He entered his debit card information, carefully checking each number twice. His hands were steady, which surprised him. He had expected them to shake, and they didn't. The confirmation email arrived 4 minutes later, landing in his inbox with the matter-of-fact efficiency of automated systems that have no idea what they're confirming. Congratulations, you are the winning bidder. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the dryers spin in the laundromat below, their steady rotation the only sound in the building at that hour. He wondered if he had just made the best or worst decision of his life. Probably both, he decided. The best and worst decisions were often the same decision, distinguished only by what you did with them afterward. He went to bed. He didn't sleep much. But in the morning, the decision was still there, and it still felt like the only honest thing he had left. The drive to Brown County took just under 2 hours through autumn countryside that had turned itself into something a painter would have been proud of. Rust and gold and the deep amber of oak trees holding their color against the coming cold, the whole landscape making one last extravagant statement before winter arrived to simplify everything. Grady had picked Owen up that Saturday morning with gas station coffee and a box of donuts, a peace offering. The boy accepted with a grunt and consumed in silence 3 donuts gone before they'd cleared the Bloomington city limits. He'd told Owen they were going to look at a property. He'd kept the details deliberately vague, partly because he wasn't sure yet how to explain what he'd done, and partly because he'd chosen what he privately acknowledged was the coward's approach: let the boy see it first and deal with the reaction in real time rather than in the abstract. The abstract version would have had Owen refusing to leave the apartment. The real version at least got him in the truck. Owen sat with his legs pushed against the dashboard in the way that tall teenagers occupy vehicles, earbuds and staring out the passenger window, with the particular blankness that teenagers develop when they want to be somewhere else without the trouble of actually leaving. Grady drove through the suburbs, past strip malls and subdivisions that gave way to farmland, and then to the kind of countryside that reminded you the world was larger than the parts of it most people used. The sky got bigger as they drove. The traffic disappeared. The radio played a country station. Grady didn't change because the music didn't require any attention, and that was exactly what he had available for it. Nashville, Indiana was less a town than a suggestion of one. A main street with antique shops and a general store and an ice cream place that was already closed for the season, and the kind of unhurried atmosphere that drew city people on fall weekends to buy handmade candles and take photographs of the leaves and feel briefly like they understood something about a simpler way of living. 3 miles outside Nashville proper, Harlow Creek Road turned off the main route, a narrow 2-lane that wound through thick second-growth forest and past properties marked only by rusted mailboxes and gravel tracks disappearing into trees. Grady almost missed the turn. He caught it at the last moment when his headlights swept across a mailbox that read 2241 in faded numbers, the post leaning at an angle that suggested it had been considering falling over for several years and hadn't quite committed to it. He turned onto what the listing had called a driveway. It was more accurately 2 parallel tracks of compressed earth cutting through tall weeds and brush that had grown together overhead in places, branches scraping against both sides of the truck as he eased forward through the tunnel of overgrowth. The trees broke suddenly into a clearing, the way forests sometimes do when they've been holding something back. And there it was. The photographs had not lied exactly, but they had failed to capture the full weight of it, the scale of the abandonment, the way the house stood at the center of 3 overgrown acres, like something that had simply been forgotten by the world left behind when everyone else moved on, too far gone to be worth rescuing, and not quite gone enough to stop being there. The white paint was not merely peeling. It was mostly gone, leaving weathered clapboard the color of old pewter, the wood beneath taking on the gray patience of something that has stopped expecting to be seen. The porch sagged so dramatically in the center that the railing posts on either side rose above the midpoint like the ends of a frown turned upside down. Every window Grady could see from the truck was either broken or missing entirely dark openings that gave the house the appearance of something hollowed out, a structure from which all the essential warmth had long since escaped. The ivy had claimed the entire right side of the building thick as rope, and in the October stillness, it moved slightly in a breeze that Grady couldn't feel from inside the cab. Behind the house, a barn leaned heavily to one side, and its roof partially collapsed inward, the whole structure maintaining its position through some combination of stubbornness and the interconnected support of failing pieces. Ancient farm equipment sat in the tall grass around it, the remains of what might have been a tractor, once reduced now to a rusted silhouette of its former function. Beside it, something else, unidentifiable, just corroded metal, returning slowly to the earth it had come from. The clearing was bordered on 3 sides by dense woods, trees that pressed in close not menacingly, but with the simple persistence of living things filling the available space. Grady put the truck in park and killed the engine. The silence was extraordinary. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a place that had its own sounds, quieter and more particular than the sounds of human habitation. Wind through branches, the occasional distant call of a bird settling in for the afternoon. The specific stillness that rural Indiana achieves in late October when the tourist season is over, and the landscape is preparing itself for winter with a seriousness that has no room for noise. Owen pulled out one earbud, slowly as if the silence was something he needed to accommodate before he could fully enter it. He stared through the windshield at the house for a long time without saying anything, his face doing the work of processing something he hadn't been prepared for. "Then what is this?" "It's ours," Grady said quietly. "I bought it." Owen turned to look at his father. His expression moved through confusion and arrived somewhere near horror, the specific horror of someone whose worst suspicion about an unknown situation has been confirmed and exceeded. "You bought this. $500, foreclosure auction, 3 acres, the house, and the barn." "Dad." Owen's voice went flat in the way it did when he was managing something bigger than flatness, could actually contain, using the tone as a lid on something that needed to be kept covered. "This is not a house. This is what happens after a house gives up. It needs work. It needs a demolition permit and possibly an exorcism." Owen looked back at the structure. "Please tell me you didn't spend actual money on this." $500. Everything I had." A beat of silence longer than the others. Then Owen turned to face him fully, and the lid came off whatever had been under the flatness. "The money. The money Mom called about. The money she said was for my winter clothes. You spent that on this. Your mother wanted that money for herself, to build a case, to use against me in court. So your solution was to buy a condemned building." Owen's voice was rising now, not purely from anger, but from something more complicated underneath it. Something that sounded, if you listened carefully enough, like fear. Fear that his father had finally made the mistake that would cost them everything they'd fought for. Fear that the thing Grady had been building toward for 2 years had just been traded for a ruin in the woods. Do you ever think before you do something, do you make actual plans, or do you just react to things and hope they work out? Grady kept his voice level. He had learned over the past 2 years that volume rarely helped and sometimes made permanent what might otherwise have been temporary. "I think about you. Every decision I make is about giving you something better than what we have right now. Better than what an apartment with working electricity and walls that keep the weather out, because I'm fairly sure this place doesn't have those things." Owen shoved the truck door open. "I need to get out of this cab." Grady watched his son walk toward the house with his hands pushed into his jacket pockets and his shoulders drawn up around his ears, carrying the anger in the way teenagers carry everything with the full commitment of a body that hasn't yet learned to distribute weight. He'd known this was coming. He'd prepared himself for it, rehearsed his responses, anticipated the arguments. But watching it arrive in real time was still like taking a fist to the sternum. The preparation and the reality of it were entirely different experiences. He climbed out of the truck. His boots sank slightly into the soft ground, which smelled of wet leaves and the particular earthiness of land that hadn't been walked on regularly in years. The October air carried cold coming and the smell of decay that was also the smell of change, the two being in autumn essentially the same thing. He tested the porch steps. The first 2 crumbled under his weight like wet cardboard, their structural integrity having departed entirely some years ago. He worked his way around to the side of the porch, found a section near the corner where the boards were harder, less compromised, and pulled himself up carefully. The front door opened when he pushed it, the lock mechanism having dissolved to rust so completely that the door had long since abandoned the pretense of being secured. It swung inward with a sound like something being woken from a very long sleep. The smell hit him first, mold and old wood and time, and the accumulated presence of small animals that had moved through and taken up residence in the years when the house belonged to no one. Not unpleasant exactly, just heavy. The smell of a place that had been left to itself and had developed its own ecosystem in the absence of human intention. Grady turned on his phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The interior told a more honest story than the exterior, the way interiors usually do. Water damage had spread across the walls and ceiling in brown blooms, the stains tracking the history of every place the roof had failed and every storm that had found its way in over the years. The hardwood floors had warped and buckled where moisture had worked its way into the grain, and in places they had given way, entirely boards missing, to reveal the crawl space below and the smell of cold earth. Plaster had fallen from the ceiling in sections, exposing the original lath underneath, and the electrical wiring visible through those gaps Looked like it had last been updated sometime during the Eisenhower administration. But the bones. Grady moved his flashlight slowly across the structure, reading it the way he read engines, looking past the failure to the foundation. The walls were plumb, not leaning, not separating from the floor plates. The ceiling joists visible through the plaster gaps showed no rot, no separation, no sag under their own weight. The brick chimney rising through the center of the house looked solid from every angle. He could find the mortar between courses still intact, the whole structure true and vertical after 100 years. The staircase in the hallway held his weight without complaint when he tested the first 3 steps, which was more than many staircases in much younger houses would have done. It was damaged, severely, but it was not beyond saving. He knew the difference. That was the thing. After 17 years of looking at broken things and deciding which ones were worth the effort of repair, he knew the difference between damage and death, between a problem and a verdict. Owen appeared in the doorway backlit by the pale October daylight, outside a silhouette that was becoming less of a boy and more of a man in a way that Grady kept noticing and then trying not to dwell on too heavily, because dwelling on it led to other thoughts about time and loss. It smells like something died in here. Probably several somethings over several decades. Grady moved his light around the room. Come in carefully. Test the floor before you put your weight on it. Owen entered with the exaggerated caution of someone who expects the floor to make a decision about him rather than the other way around. He moved to the center of the living room and turned slowly, taking in the fireplace, the fallen plasters, dark blooms on the ceiling, the window openings that let in rectangles of gray October light. You're serious about this? I'm serious about this. With what money you spent everything on the purchase. I have my tools. I have time. I know how to fix things, Owen. It's literally what I do for a living. You fix cars. I fix broken things. The principles are the same. Grady moved his light to the fireplace, the brick intact, the original mantle, still attached to the wall, still level, still present after a century of whatever this house had been through. Look at this fireplace. That's original masonry from 1924, and it's still standing. The chimney's solid. The joists are good. The foundation hasn't moved. Owen looked at the fireplace with the skepticism of someone not yet prepared to see potential in ruins, but he looked at it. He kept his eyes on it for a few seconds longer than dismissal would have required. That was something. They moved through the first floor together, Grady pointing out elements that existed more in potential than reality, using the mechanic's habit of describing what a thing would be when it worked, rather than what it was when it didn't. The kitchen with its ancient porcelain sink cracked along one basin, but still attached to the wall, still connected to pipes that might still connect to water. The dining room with built-in shelves along one wall that had somehow survived the decades with their joinery intact, the dovetail corners holding where cheaper construction would have given way. The ceiling height, 9 feet at least, that spoke to an era when houses were built with the ambition of people who expected to live in them for generations. Owen said almost nothing, but he stopped pulling toward the door. He stopped positioning himself for exit. Something in him was listening, even if he wasn't yet ready to let that show. The staircase held them both when they went up, which was a more important test than it sounded. The second floor offered 3 bedrooms, all in states of significant deterioration, all telling the same story of water and time. In one room, wallpaper still clung to the walls in strips of floral pattern, in faded blue and cream, that had probably been cheerful when it was applied and was now just evidence of a decision someone had made decades ago that still partially persisted. In another, a section of the floor had given way entirely, a gap that looked down into the ceiling of the kitchen, below a reminder of what inadequate maintenance eventually produced. And in the third bedroom, the smallest one at the end of the hallway, something that stopped them both. Pinned to the wall with a thumbtack so rusted it had fused permanently into the plaster, was a child's drawing, crayon on notebook paper slightly warped by time and moisture, but otherwise intact, as if whatever quality of preservation had protected the hidden room downstairs had extended at least this far. It showed a house with a smiling sun above it and 4 stick figures in front, 2 large and 2 small, and all of them had smiles that took up most of their faces in the unambiguous way that children draw happiness. In the careful block letters of a child who has recently learned that letters have power, my home. And in the bottom corner, a date, June 1994. Owen stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. He looked at it the way you look at something that tells you something true about the world, something you already knew but hadn't had occasion to see stated so plainly. Someone lived here, he said finally. Not a question, a recognition, a family. Grady studied the drawing, the sun, the smiles, the word home written with absolute conviction, with the certainty of someone for whom the concept was still simple and solid. Until about 30 years ago. Why did they leave everything? I don't know yet. Owen reached up and touched the edge of the drawing gently, not moving it, just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge something that deserves acknowledgement. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but the armor thinning slightly the way it does when something gets through before the defenses can respond. You said yet. I said yet. Owen turned away from the drawing and stood in the center of the room looking at the walls, the ceiling, the window that let in a pale rectangle of afternoon light. His hands came out of his pockets, which was the small physical signal that he had stopped preparing to leave. You've thought about this. Not just last night, before you spent the money. You'd already been thinking about it. Grady nodded slowly. 2 weeks. You researched it. Every night after shift. Owen looked at him for a moment, then back at the room. You should have told me. You're right, I should have. The silence between them was different from the silence in the truck. Less like a wall and more like a door left slightly ajar, the kind you could push open if you chose to. They went back downstairs, stepping carefully around the compromised sections of floor and out through the front of the house. The October light was dropping toward afternoon, and the clearing around the house glowed with the last of the fall color, the kind of light that makes even ruined things look like they might be worth saving. Grady went back into the kitchen. He began pulling the fallen cabinet upright to check the wall, behind it the methodical assessment of a man who has learned to look at everything before deciding what anything means. The cabinet was beyond saving its particle board swollen and crumbling, but the wall behind it was intact. He worked his way along the counter, testing surfaces, cataloging what existed and what was possible. He was reaching back to check the condition of the wall framing behind where the cabinet had sat when his fingers caught on something. A corner. A slick surface different from the texture of wood or plaster. He pulled carefully. It was a photograph, not a standard photograph. A Polaroid, the instant kind its white border yellowed, and its image faded to the muted tones of something that has been hidden from light for decades, but still visible, still telling its story to anyone who looked closely enough. He brought his flashlight close and wiped the dust from the surface with the edge of his sleeve. 3 people standing in front of this house. But the house as it must have looked 30 years ago when someone loved it. Paint fresh and white, porch straight and level, a geometry of care and intention. Flower boxes beneath the windows with something growing in them. A tire swing hanging from the oak tree that still stood at the edge of the clearing, and a girl of 7 or 8 caught mid-swing in the photograph, her feet off the ground. The same girl standing between a man and a woman, all 3 of them squinting into the summer sun, all 3 of them smiling in the unself-conscious way of people who believe they have arrived somewhere. The man was in his late 30s, brown hair, work clothes, one arm around a woman with gentle eyes, and a tired smile that was also a real smile, both things at once. Between them, a little girl of maybe 7 or 8, grinning at the camera with 2 front teeth, missing the grin of someone for whom happiness is not yet a complicated thing. Written on the white border at the bottom in handwriting that had faded to barely legible Harlan Lorraine Wren. First summer in our dream house. Grady turned the Polaroid over, on the back more writing. Different hands, slightly larger, more deliberate. The handwriting of someone composing something rather than just noting a date. He read it twice before the meaning fully arrived. We made it. This is the place we always talked about. Wren loves her room. So much work ahead of us. But we're happy here. We're actually happy. He stood in the ruined kitchen of someone's dream house, holding the evidence of a happiness that had clearly ended badly, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not hope, not yet, but the shape of a question that mattered, which was the thing that came before hope and was in some ways more important. He walked outside to where Owen was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking at the woods with the expression of someone who has been doing some thinking while pretending not to. His son turned when he heard him coming, and Grady held up the Polaroid. Owen took it and looked at it for a long time, at the little girl's missing front teeth, at the fresh paint on the house behind them, at the tire swing and the flower boxes, and the 3 people who had looked at a camera on a summer day and been genuinely uncomplicated, happy. Wren, he said, reading the name. Harlan, Lorraine, and Wren, summer of 1994, same year as that drawing upstairs. What happened to them? That, Grady said, is what I intend to find out. Owen looked at the Polaroid once more, then at his father. Something had changed in his expression. Not agreement, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of curiosity, and curiosity was something. It was being pulled toward a story larger than your own frustration, and that was a start. He handed the photograph back carefully, with the care you use for things that belong to someone else, even when you're not sure who that someone is anymore. 1 month, he said. You've got 1 month to make this place livable. If we're still camping here by Thanksgiving, I'm telling Mom everything. It wasn't trust. It was a negotiation with conditions attached. But Grady had spent 17 years learning the difference between a yes and a not yet, and this was a not yet, which was entirely different from a no. He nodded once, then his phone buzzed. A text from Sylvia sent at 4:47 in the afternoon, the timestamp suggesting she had been composing it for a while before sending. He read it standing in the clearing with the Polaroid in one hand and the phone in the other, the house behind him, and the woods pressing in on three sides, and the October light going amber and specific the way it does in the hour before sunset. Douglas looked into the property. Says there's a history, child services, something about a secret room. Call me when you get this. We need to talk about what kind of environment you're putting our son in. Grady read the message twice. Then he looked up at the house, at the dark window openings, at the sagging porch where someone had once installed flower boxes because they believed in the permanence of what they were building. Douglas Fenn, Sylvia's brother, the man who had sat across from Grady at every family dinner for 14 years, with his expensive suits and his silver hair and his warm, practiced handshake, and the quality of attention he gave to conversations that made everyone feel specifically seen and understood. The man who had apparently been doing research on a property Grady had owned for less than a week. The man who already knew about a secret room. The man who, as far as Grady could determine, had no reason to know about any room at all. Not unless he already knew things about this property that he hadn't come to through any ordinary or recent route. He slid the phone back into his pocket. He looked at Owen, who was watching him with those dark eyes that caught everything and released nothing until they were ready. Everything okay? Owen asked. Working on it. Grady tucked the Polaroid carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, the way you carry something you're not sure about yet, but aren't willing to put down. Let's go see about getting the power turned on. They walked back toward the house together, father and son, through the fallen light of an October afternoon, into a structure that held more history than either of them understood yet. And somewhere above them in the walls of the second floor, something waited that Grady Mercer had not yet found. Something that had been waiting for 30 years for exactly the right person to come looking. Some truths are not discovered. They are excavated. Layer by layer, the way a careful man works through the damaged parts of an engine, removing what has failed in order to find what still holds. The process requires patience and a tolerance for finding things worse than you expected, and the discipline not to stop before you've reached the bottom of it. Grady Mercer had spent 17 years learning to read things that couldn't speak for themselves. Engines, transmissions, brake systems worn down past the point where most men would have noticed, past the point where the car gave any warning that was legible to someone not paying close attention. He understood that damage had a language, that rust and warping and stress fractures told stories about history and stress and the accumulated cost of being used hard and maintained poorly. He had never expected that skill to transfer beyond the shop floor at Kellerman Auto. He was wrong about that. The first week at 2241 Harlow Creek Road was about survival in the most basic sense. Not the dramatic survival of emergency, but the unglamorous incremental survival of a man who has made a decision and now has to live inside the consequences of it one day at a time. They slept on camping pads on the living room floor, the brick fireplace throwing enough heat to keep the temperature in the livable range through nights that dropped into the low 30s. Grady cooked on a propane camp stove he'd kept from a hunting trip 3 years ago, a piece of equipment he had never expected to use this way. He got the power turned back on for $50 and spent the better part of an afternoon persuading pipes that had sat dormant for over 2 decades to remember what they were for. The water ran brown for 20 minutes, the color of old rust and older neglect, then gradually cleared to something he could test and use. Small victories, the kind that don't look like much from the outside but feel like survival from the inside because they are. Owen adapted the way teenagers adapt when they have no other option, with visible resentment and quiet competence that coexisted without resolving into either one. He complained about the cold specifically and at length. He complained about the 40-minute bus ride to his school in Nashville. He complained about the absence of a proper shower, the clawfoot tub, requiring 3 minutes of running water before it stopped producing something that looked like diluted rust. But he stopped asking to go back to Bloomington after the third day. He started carrying tools when Grady worked, anticipating what was needed in the particular way of someone who has been around work long enough to understand its rhythms. He learned without being explicitly taught how to hand a wrench before it was asked for how to hold a board steady, without being told how to be useful in the specific, quiet way that gets things done. They were building something, not just the house, though that too. Grady worked at Kellerman during the days, driving the 45 minutes each direction without complaint, using the time to plan the evening's work in his head. He had a system, one problem at a time, never looking at the whole list because the whole list would have paralyzed anyone, and he was too old and too tired to afford paralysis. Today, the porch support post. Tomorrow, the section of roof above the upstairs hallway. Next week, the soft spot in the kitchen floor before someone went through it and added a new problem to the existing ones. He also drove to the Brown County Public Library on the first Saturday morning before Owen was awake, because the question of what had happened to Harlan Pruitt and his family had settled into his thinking the way important questions do, occupying space that would otherwise have been used for other things. The librarian, a quiet woman named Beverly, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the unhurried manner of someone who understood that good information was worth taking the time to find, properly showed him how to access the county's property records database and the digitized newspaper archive from a terminal in the corner. Grady sat down and searched methodically. Harlan Pruitt, 2241 Harlow Creek Road. The property records confirmed the broad outline he had already assembled. Harlan had purchased the land and structure in March of 1989 for $41,000, which was what a working man with a good credit history and a down payment saved over several years could afford in Brown County in that period. The house had been built in 1924, had passed through 5 owners in the intervening decades, and had been in varying states of repair through its history. Tax records showed continuous payment from 1989 through 1999, the regular rhythm of a family meeting its obligations. Then nothing. A gap in the record absence where presence should have been. Then a bank foreclosure filing in February of 2002, and after that 23 years of silence. The newspaper archive yielded almost nothing of substance. A mention of the Pruitt name in a 1996 church fundraiser, listing one name among dozens. A classified ad from 1994 offering a used lawnmower, contact H. Pruitt, with a phone number that no longer existed. And then in the archived digital edition of the Brown County Courier from January 2000, a single paragraph buried in the local notes section near the back of the paper, the section where editors put the things that needed to be recorded without being dwelt upon. He read it 3 times, looking for more than it contained. It said only that County Child Protective Services had conducted a welfare check at a rural property on Harlow Creek Road in December 1999. The family involved had declined to comment. No charges were filed. The item had the quality of a story that someone had wanted to tell, but couldn't constrain by what was and wasn't on the public record, shaped by lawyers and discretion into something that communicated without explaining. Grady drove back to the house with the photocopied pages on the passenger seat and a feeling in his chest that wasn't quite dread and wasn't quite anticipation. Something between the two. The feeling of standing at the edge of a body of water and not yet knowing whether you're going to find the bottom with your feet or lose it. He stopped at the general store on Nashville's Main Street. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his late 70s, weathered and deliberate, with the appearance of someone who had watched the same small town for 50 years and accumulated through that watching a knowledge that didn't get recorded anywhere, but was no less real for that. Grady asked about the Pruitt family, about Harlan. The man was quiet for a moment, conducting the particular evaluation of someone deciding how much to give away to a stranger, what the cost and benefit of candor were in this specific situation. You the one who bought that property? Yes, sir. Another pause. Harlan Pruitt was a decent man, worked construction, good at it too, kept himself to himself mostly but not unfriendly. His wife Lorraine was quieter still. The little girl Wren, she was a sweet kid but nervous around people she didn't know. Took a while to warm up to anyone new. He straightened a jar of beef jerky on the counter that didn't need straightening, a displacement activity of someone choosing words. What happened to them was a shame. Town was divided about it. Some people thought Harlan had gone off the deep end. Others figured there was more to the story than what got told. What do you think? The man looked at him for a long moment, the evaluation continuing. I think good men sometimes end up in impossible situations. And I think the people who are supposed to help don't always see the whole picture before they act on what they think they see. He picked up a rag and wiped down a section of counter that didn't need wiping. That's all I'll say about it. Grady thanked him and drove back to Harlow Creek Road with the knowledge that he was standing at the edge of a story that the town had never finished telling, a story that had simply been set aside unresolved when the people at its center left. It was Owen who found the wall. Grady was downstairs reinforcing the kitchen floor joists on a Tuesday evening, lying on his back in the crawl space with a headlamp strapped to his forehead and considerably more patience than the job seemed to deserve, given that each joist required precise measurement and careful sistering to the damaged original without disturbing what was still functional. Owen was upstairs, which was where he spent his evenings now, sometimes doing homework at the small folding table Grady had set up in what would eventually be his room, sometimes simply existing in the space with the quality of a young man who is working something out that doesn't have words yet. Grady heard the knocking, not loud, methodical, deliberate, the sound of someone testing rather than building, investigating rather than working. He extracted himself from the crawl space and climbed the stairs following the sound to the upstairs hallway, where he found Owen with his knuckles pressed against the wall, moving systematically from left to right, rapping every 6 inches or so, his head tilted toward the wall to listen to what came back. This section, Owen said without looking up, sounds different from the rest. Grady listened. Owen knocked again, first against the section near the bathroom door, dense and immediate, then moving 18 inches to the right and knocking again. The difference was subtle but real. One produced the shallow, solid sound of a wall backed by framing and insulation, and another wall on the other side. The other returned something deeper, emptier, the resonant sound of space that had no business being where it was. Could be different framing. Old houses develop quirks. The quirk goes all the way from here to here. Owen moved down the hallway, knocking every 6 inches, stopping where the sound changed back to solid. That's almost 6 feet of hollow wall, and it's only on this side of the hallway, not the other. Grady got his tape measure from his tool belt. He measured the exterior dimensions of the house at the second floor level, which required going outside and converting his measurements to account for the wall thickness, then came back up and measured every interior room on the second floor and added the hallway width. Then he did the arithmetic. The exterior said the second floor was 41 feet long. The interior measurements gave him 36. He measured again, carefully and without hurrying, with the methodical attention he gave to engine tolerances, where a small error produced large consequences. Same result, 5 feet of space that the interior measurements couldn't account for, 5 feet that the house contained, but that no room claimed. Son of a gun, he said quietly. Owen was already on his knees at the base of the hollow wall section, examining the baseboard, with his phone's flashlight running the beam slowly along the junction between the baseboard and the floor. Dad, come look at this. Grady crouched beside him. The baseboard along the hollow section was subtly different from the rest of the hallway trim, slightly newer in profile, a different molding pattern, less worn at the top edge where hands and cleaning equipment make contact over years. The paint layered over it was thinner, the color marginally brighter if you were comparing it to the rest and knew what you were looking for. Someone had replaced this specific section of baseboard at some point after the original installation and had painted over the seam to make it continuous with the rest. Grady took his utility knife and scored carefully along the top edge where the baseboard met the wall, breaking the paint seal. He worked a putty knife behind it, feeling for resistance, working slowly to avoid damaging anything that might matter. The baseboard came away cleanly, leaving a clean gap between the drywall and the floor. Behind the baseboard in the gap where no one would think to look unless they were looking for exactly this was an envelope. Standard white business envelope, unsealed, addressed to no one. Grady held it for a moment without opening it. The weight of it was minimal. 3 or 4 pages, maybe. He looked at Owen, who was very still beside him, and then he opened it. Inside, 3 pages of lined paper covered in a woman's handwriting, the ink faded at the margins but legible through the center lines. The letter was dated June 14th, 1997. It began, "Dear Carol." Grady's hand went still. He read the salutation again. Carol. An ordinary name, but the name of someone outside this family, outside this house, outside whatever was happening inside it. Lorraine Pruitt had written to her closest friend, a woman named Carol, who had moved to Indianapolis 2 years before, and with whom Lorraine apparently maintained the kind of friendship that survives geography through the written word. The letter had never been sent. It was clear from the first paragraph that Lorraine had written it not to communicate, but to think, using the form of a letter to organize thoughts that had nowhere else to go, in a house where she felt she couldn't speak them aloud. She wrote about Harlan, about how he had been working on something in the house for nearly a year, a project he refused to explain fully that seemed to be happening in the upper part of the house in the evenings after their daughter was in bed. She wrote about the money, the savings account they had built over 8 years of careful living that was now nearly gone spent on materials whose purpose she didn't fully understand. She wrote about Wren. "He says she needs a safe place," Lorraine had written. "Somewhere no one can find her when she's frightened." I didn't understand at first what he meant by no one. I thought he meant the world in general, the anxiety she's always had, the way new situations overwhelm her. But I'm starting to think he means someone specific. And that thought frightens me more than anything he's built in those walls. And then Douglas has been coming around more lately. Wren disappears every time he arrives. Goes to her room, won't come out for dinner, won't explain why when I ask her. When I talk to Harlan about it, he gets very quiet in the way he gets quiet when he's made a decision he doesn't want to be argued out of. I'm scared, Carol. Not of Harlan. He's the best man I know. I'm scared of what he knows that I don't yet. I'm scared that the thing he's building is an answer to a question I haven't been brave enough to ask. She wrote about the arguments over money, about Harlan working in the upstairs section of the house every night after Wren was in bed, the sounds of careful construction that stopped immediately whenever Lorraine came to investigate. She wrote about asking what he was building and receiving the same answer each time in different words that all meant the same thing, something that keeps her safe. Safe from what Lorraine had written. That's what I can't get him to answer. And the fact that he won't answer is its own kind of answer, isn't it? I just haven't decided yet whether I'm ready to hear it. The letter ended mid-thought, as if Lorraine had been interrupted and had set the letter down, meaning to return to it, and never had. Grady folded the pages carefully and looked at Owen. His son had read it over his shoulder. His face was very still. The particular stillness of someone who has received information that takes a moment to fully become real. "Douglas," Owen said, quietly, as if saying the name with care might keep it from fully arriving and everything it was bringing with it. Grady nodded. "Douglas Fenn, Mom's brother." "Yes." Owen sat back against the opposite wall of the hallway and stared at the baseboard gap where the letter had lived for 28 years, waiting for exactly this moment. He was coming to visit this family, and their daughter was hiding from him. That's what the letter says. And Harlan built her a place to hide. Yes. Owen was quiet for a moment, working through it in the methodical way Grady had noticed his son approach things that required thinking before speaking. Then, "There's a room behind this wall. That's what the hollow section is. He didn't just build her a hiding place somewhere in the house. He built it into the house itself. That's what I think." They looked at each other in the dim hallway, the LED lantern casting long shadows across the damaged plaster, and the weight of what was forming between them was too large and too serious for either of them to put into words yet. Grady felt it settle into his chest like ballast, heavy and stabilizing simultaneously, the feeling of understanding something important even before you understand all of it. "We have to find it," Owen said. "Yes," Grady agreed, "we do." They spent the better part of an hour searching for an entrance. The hollow section of wall was perfectly seamless when examined from the hallway side. No visible seams in the paint, no hardware, no irregularity that could serve as a handle or a release mechanism. Grady pressed along the entire 6-foot section, systematically varying the pressure, listening for any mechanical response beneath his palms. Nothing. It opens from somewhere else, Owen reasoned, which was correct. You couldn't seal yourself in from the hallway side, which meant the entrance was through one of the adjacent rooms. They checked the bathroom, going over every surface with flashlights, solid throughout, nothing that responded to pressure or revealed a seam. They checked the bedroom on the right side of the hollow section, the room where old floral wallpaper still clung to the walls in strips, blue and cream flowers on a pale background, the pattern repeating at intervals set by whoever had hung it decades ago. Grady went over every surface with his flashlight, pressing and testing and listening. The wallpaper complicated the reading of the wall beneath it, adding a layer of texture and visual noise that made it harder to see what the wall itself was doing. He was working his way around the room when he noticed it. In one section of wallpaper, roughly 3 feet from the floor, the floral pattern didn't quite align. It was a matter of perhaps half an inch, a small displacement, in the repetition of the pattern, as if a section of wall surface had shifted slightly at some point relative to the surrounding wallpaper. A person walking through the room wouldn't see it. A person cleaning the room wouldn't see it. You would only see it if you were looking very carefully at the wall rather than at what was hanging on it, which almost no one ever did. Grady pressed against that section. The wallpaper dimpled inward slightly more than the solid plaster behind it should have allowed for. He pressed harder, with more deliberate force. Something clicked, a mechanism engaging a latch releasing with the careful precision of something that had been built to work silently. A section of wall approximately 2 feet wide and 6 feet tall swung inward a single inch. No more than that, just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness along one edge, and with the darkness, a smell. Stale air, undisturbed for years, carrying beneath it something sweeter and sadder that Grady couldn't immediately name, but recognized as the smell of a preserved childhood, the specific combination of old paper and fabric and wooden toys that accumulates in a space where a child has spent significant time. He got his fingers into the edge and pulled. The door swung open on concealed hinges that had been fitted and balanced with a craftsman's precision, moving smoothly and silently in a way that spoke of someone who had cared about this enough to do it right. The wallpaper applied to its surface had been matched to the surrounding wall with patience and skill, the pattern aligned within the acceptable margin close enough to be invisible under normal circumstances. Harlan Pruitt had built this the way he built everything Grady understood, with the full attention of a man who believed that the quality of the work was not negotiable. The darkness beyond was complete. Grady raised his flashlight. The beam entered the hidden room and found a small world that had been carefully made and then sealed away from time for 26 years, a world preserved in the amber of abandonment. Everything exactly as it had been left on the night in December 1999, when the door had been closed for the last time. He stepped through first. The floor was solid beneath him, the same hardwood as the rest of the second floor, but cleaner, protected from the water damage that had compromised the hallway and the adjacent rooms by the quality of the construction surrounding it. The walls were painted a soft yellow, the color of early morning light, through a curtained window, and along the upper edges, near the ceiling, someone had stenciled white clouds at careful intervals. Small, simple clouds, the kind a child would draw, each one slightly different from the others, because they had been painted by hand rather than stamped by a machine. A twin bed sat against the far wall, made up with a purple comforter, printed with gold stars, compressed now by years and faded by time, but still present, still maintaining the shape of its original making. A wooden nightstand beside it held a lamp shaped like a crescent moon, its bulb long burned out. A small wooden bookshelf lined one wall, filled with children's books arranged by size with the care of someone who had opinions about where things belonged. Little House on the Prairie, A Wrinkle in Time, Charlotte's Web, the complete Harry Potter series in hardcover, the spines showing the wear of a reader who had returned to them many times the way you return to books that contain something you need to keep finding. A wooden toy chest sat beneath the bookshelf, its lid closed. But it was the walls that stopped Grady completely. Every available surface, every inch of yellow paint not occupied by furniture, was covered in children's drawings. Crayon, marker, pencil, watercolor. Dozens upon dozens of them, taped in careful overlapping rows, creating a dense collage that covered the room from shoulder height to ceiling. The drawings were dated in a child's handwriting. In the corner of each one, a habit that spoke of a child who had been taught or had decided that dates mattered, that the when of a thing was part of its meaning. Grady moved his flashlight slowly across them, following the dates. The earliest ones from 1995 were what you expected from a child of 7 or 8. Houses with smoking chimneys, families of stick figures holding hands in rows, flowers in neat lines under smiling suns, horses and dogs and birds arranged in cheerful scenes that reflected a world as the child wished it to be rather than as it was. But as he moved around the room following the dates forward through time, the drawings changed. The colors grew darker. Blues became grays. Reds appeared where they hadn't before, used not for flowers or sunsets, but for things with no clear, referent, abstract expressions of something that color could hold better than shape. The families lost members until there was only one figure, small and isolated, standing alone in the center of the page, with open space around her that felt less like freedom and more like exposure. Houses developed bars on the windows. The flowers wilted and drooped on their stems. One drawing dated March 1998 showed this house recognizable by the shape of its roofline and the particular pitch of its porch, rendered in yellow crayon with the careful detail of someone who knew the subject intimately. But one small section of the upper floor had been colored solid black, no detail, just black, and beside it, in the painstaking block letters of a child who had worked to make each one precise, "My safe place." Owen had entered behind him and stood at his shoulder, his own flashlight adding to the light in the room. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, a silence that was not absence, but the presence of something that required space. "She lived here," Owen said finally. His voice was different, quieter, with a quality in it that hadn't been there before. "Not just visited it, she actually lived in this room. When she needed to." Owen moved to the nightstand where a framed photograph sat beside the crescent moon lamp. He picked it up carefully. The photograph showed a girl of perhaps 11 or 12 sitting on the front porch of this house, hugging her knees to her chest, looking at the camera, with eyes that held something too old for her face. Not sad exactly. Something beyond sadness. The expression of someone who has already determined that wariness was the most reliable way to move through the world. "That's Wren," Owen said. Not a question. Grady looked at the photograph, at the careful way the girl held herself, making herself small in a way that had become habitual. At the porch boards beneath her, straight and newly repaired, the same porch Grady had just finished restoring. He thought about what it meant to sit on your own porch and look at the world with eyes like that. Owen set the photograph down exactly where it had been and moved to the toy chest. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside, arranged with the care of someone who had opinions about the proper order of things, stuffed animals and board games, and a deflated beach ball, and other artifacts of a childhood preserved in the amber of the room's isolation. Owen reached in carefully, not to take anything, but to understand the space, and his hand found the edge of something beneath the layered contents, a seam in the wooden bottom that interrupted the grain in a way that wood didn't do naturally. He looked up at Grady. Grady crouched beside him. He worked his utility knife along the seam, prying gently. The false bottom lifted out, cleanly balanced on a hidden pivot, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside the compartment, 2 items: a composition notebook, the black and white speckled kind that school children had been using for decades. On the inside cover in crayon, in the confident assertion of a child establishing territory, "Wren Pruitt Private Journal. Journal do not read." And beneath the journal, wrapped in a cloth that had once been a kitchen towel with a faded pattern of blue checks, a leather-bound book larger and heavier, with a man's name pressed into the cover in simple block stamps, the letters worn at the edges from handling H. Pruitt. Grady lifted both, carefully holding them with the awareness of what they represented. He opened the composition notebook first. The early entries were ordinary, the record of an ordinary childhood. School and friends, and a teacher she liked because she explained things without making anyone feel slow. Complaints about a math assignment. A full paragraph about a dog she had seen tied up outside the Nashville general store that she wanted desperately, the dog described in such specific detail that it became real on the page. The handwriting of a girl discovering that words could hold things, could make them stay. Then further in the entries changed. November 3rd, 1997. "Daddy finished my special room today. It's so pretty. Yellow like sunshine, and he painted clouds on the ceiling himself. He says I can come here whenever I need to feel safe." I asked him, safe from what? He just hugged me and didn't answer. But I think I know. January 15th, 1998. Mom and Daddy had a fight about money again. I heard them through the wall. Mom says the room costs too much. Daddy says some things you can't put a price on. I don't want them to fight because of me, but I also don't want the room to go away. April 22nd, 1998. Douglas came today. I went to my safe room before he even got here when I heard the car in the driveway. Daddy brought me a sandwich later and sat with me for a while without talking. That's one of the things I love about Daddy. He knows when talking isn't the right thing. Grady read more slowly now. July 8th, 1998. Douglas came again. He asked where I was. I heard him through the wall. His voice sounds different when he's looking for me, like it goes flatter and quieter at the same time. Mom told him I was at a friend's house. I wasn't. I was right there, 3 feet away from where he was standing. Douglas said, "That's too bad I haven't seen my favorite girl in so long. I don't like being called that." October 12th, 1998. Douglas came alone this time. I heard everything. He asked Daddy if I was afraid of him. Daddy said I was just shy around visitors. Douglas laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. He said shy girls grow out of it eventually. I'm not shy. I'm afraid. There's a difference, and he knows there's a difference. Then the last entry. December 3rd, 1999. They found me. I don't know how Douglas knew about the room. He brought a woman with papers, and she had the right to search the house, and Daddy couldn't stop her. She found the door. She made me come out. Douglas was standing in the hallway watching when I came out. He smiled at me, like the way you smile when you've been right about something all along and now everyone has to admit it. The woman asked me questions. Was I scared? Did my parents hurt me? I said no. She didn't believe me. She said hiding a child in a secret room is a sign of something wrong. But I wanted to be in there. I put myself in there. It kept me safe from the entry ended there mid-sentence, as if Wren had been interrupted and had never come back to the page. Grady closed the notebook. Owen had been reading over his shoulder in silence. When Grady looked at him, the boy's expression had gone through something difficult and come out the other side of it with a kind of clarity that replaced whatever had been there before. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. He reported them, Owen said. His voice was careful and deliberate. Douglas found out about the room somehow, and he reported it to CPS, to get Wren out of the one place where she felt safe. That's what the evidence suggests. He used the system to do it. He made the protection look like the problem. Owen paused. That's not just bad, that's calculated. Grady opened Harlan's journal. The early entries were what you expected from a man who worked with his hands and thought in concrete terms, practical notes about house repairs and material costs. In project timelines, the record of a man building a life, one improvement at a time. But around the 12th page, the writing shifted register. March 3rd, 1996. Douglas visited today. Wren went to her room the moment his car came up the driveway and wouldn't come out for dinner. When I asked her about it later, she said his eyes are wrong. She couldn't explain what she meant, tried several times, and gave up. Lorraine thinks it's adjustment. She's still getting used to having extended family around after the years before. But I've been around a lot of kids in my work, kids in the neighborhood, Wren's friends from school. I know the difference between a child who's shy and a child who's afraid of something specific. Wren isn't shy around other people. She's only like this with him. August 17th, 1996. Douglas visited again. Wren ran upstairs the moment they arrived. When I went to check on her afterward, I found her in her closet, both hands over her ears, shaking in a way she couldn't control. I sat down on the floor beside her and didn't say anything for a while, just let her know I was there. After a few minutes, she whispered something that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. She said he knew me before. He knows things about me that I never told anyone. Why does he know those things? Grady stopped reading. He turned to Owen. Owen looked back at him. Both of them had arrived at the same understanding, through the same door, walking through the same evidence to the same place, and the place they had arrived at was not comfortable. Douglas Fenn had worked in child services before he became an accountant, before he built the life of a respected professional that everyone who knew him understood him to be. He had access to adoption files. He had access to the histories of vulnerable children, their fears and their wounds, and the specific knowledge of a past that a child could not share because she didn't have the words for it and because the adults around her hadn't yet asked the right questions. And through his connection to Lorraine, through the ordinary mechanism of family and friendship, and the way people move through each other's lives, he had found his way into this house. Harlan Pruitt had understood all of this, had seen it clearly, had documented it in plain practical language over years of observation, and had done the only thing he could think of to protect his daughter when no one else would listen. And the systems that were supposed to help were not tools he could access from where he stood. Grady sat on the edge of Wren's bed in the small preserved room, with the yellow walls and the hand-painted clouds, and thought about a 53-year-old man who had spent $500 on a condemned house to give his son a better life. He thought about what it meant to understand that something was wrong and to have no proof that anyone in a position of power would accept. He thought about Owen, 16 years old, who had always made sure he was never alone with his uncle at family gatherings and had never consciously known why he did that until right now. "Dad," Grady looked at his son, "Douglas asked me things." Owen's voice was controlled in the way of someone managing something significant without wanting to make it larger by speaking it too loudly. "He always wants to know my schedule, when I'm home alone, what I do after school on the days I'm not with you." I thought he was just making conversation, showing interest, being the involved uncle. A pause. "He texted me last month asking if I wanted to come to his place for the weekend. I said I was busy." He texted again 2 days later. "Has he ever?" "No." Owen was certain, and the certainty was the kind that came from thinking about it carefully rather than from not having considered it. Nothing specific, nothing I could point to, just the way he pays attention, like he's tracking something, like he's building a picture. He looked at the wall covered in Wren's drawings, at the small figure standing alone in the center of one page. Like he's waiting for the right moment. Grady stood. He crossed the room and put his hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that was not comfort exactly, but something more specific and deliberate. Grady Mercer placing himself between his son and whatever required it. "You tell me immediately if he contacts you again. You don't respond to him. You don't explain. You just tell me and let me handle it." "I know. And you trust what you feel. The way Wren trusted what she felt about him even when the adults around her called it shyness. You understand, Dad?" Owen nodded once, his jaw tightened in the way that was his father's jaw before it was his and belonged now entirely to him. They left the room. Grady closed the concealed door behind them. The click of the latch in the empty hallway was the sound of something being sealed away, and also the sound of something being decided. Downstairs, Grady made coffee on the camp stove while Owen sat at the kitchen table in the quiet that follows discovery, the particular silence of people who have learned something that can't be unlearned. They had found the room. They had found the journals. They had found the name at the center of everything. And that name was the same name that had been in Sylvia's text, the name that had been researching Grady's property. Within days of the purchase, the name that already knew about a secret room before Grady himself had found it. Now Grady needed to find Wren Pruitt. He searched for 2 hours using public records, databases, social media, alumni directories from Indiana universities, anything that might create a trail from a frightened 12-year-old in December 1999 to a person living somewhere in the present. The name Wren Pruitt appeared in a 1994 church directory for a Brown County congregation listed under the Pruitt family. After that, nothing. The girl had been removed from the public record in the same moment her family had been removed from their home. Then Owen, working his own laptop at the kitchen table, with the focused attention of a teenager who has been given a problem that matters, said quietly, "Dad, look at this." He had searched for Harlan Pruitt's obituary, reasoning that if Wren had reconnected with her father at any point, her name might appear in the death notice, which was the kind of record that preserved family connections even after they had been interrupted. There it was, a funeral home website from 2018. Harlan James Pruitt, 64, of Marion County. Heart failure following a long illness. He was survived by his daughter Wren Calloway of Portland, Oregon. She had changed her name. She had gotten out. And she had been there at the end present for her father's death, her name in the public record as his surviving family. Grady found Wren Calloway with another 20 minutes of careful searching. A professional website for a counseling practice in Portland, Oregon. The About page carried a photograph of a woman in her late 30s with her father's careful eyes and a quality of stillness that spoke of someone who had learned to carry difficult things without letting them set the terms of everything else. Her credentials were listed beneath the photograph, the formal record of a professional who had built something serious. Her email address was on the contact page. Grady wrote to her, carefully taking his time with each sentence because the situation required precision and because he was aware that he was asking a stranger to revisit the worst thing that had ever happened to her family. He explained who he was, what he had bought, what he had found in the walls of the house. He attached photographs of the hidden room of the two journals of the Polaroid. He wrote plainly the way he wrote everything, without embellishment or drama, because the facts were already more than enough, and anything added to them would only diminish their weight. He sent the email before he could second-guess himself out of sending it. They waited. At 10:43 that evening, his phone rang, a Portland area code. He answered, a woman's voice, steady and measured with an underlying quality in it that recognized difficult terrain and did not pretend otherwise. Mr. Mercer, I'm Ren Calloway. I never expected to hear from anyone connected to that house. A pause that carried the weight of 30 years in it. You found everything. Yes. Including my father's journals. Yes. Another pause longer. Then, tell me why this matters to you right now. Tell me the actual situation. So Grady told her. He told her about Sylvia, about the custody battle, and the 2 years and the $43,000. He told her about Douglas encouraging the fight from before the divorce was even finalized, inserting himself into every decision, positioning himself as the indispensable support. He told her about Owen's discomfort at family gatherings, about the texts, about the fishing invitation that Sylvia had declined because something felt wrong about how it was asked. He told her about Douglas researching the property within days of Grady's purchase, and about the text that said he already knew about the secret room. Ren was quiet on the other end for a long time. He could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone who is managing their response to something that hits close to a wound that doesn't fully close. Then she said, "That's exactly the pattern, Mr. Mercer. That's exactly how it works. He doesn't do anything that leaves a visible mark until he has access. Everything before access is positioning, building trust, removing the people who might ask inconvenient questions. Your ex-wife wasn't his target. She was his method. I know. And you're the obstacle. I know that too. I can write something for you, a formal statement. Everything I know, everything my father documented, everything I've come to understand over 20 years of working professionally with people who've survived what I survived. It won't be sufficient for criminal prosecution. It's never been sufficient for that. But it might be enough to make the person who trusts him most see clearly." A pause. Is your son's mother someone who can hear something like this? Grady thought about Sylvia, about 14 years of marriage, and what that time revealed about a person, about the woman who had fought him hard for 2 years and then hired her brother to research his new property, about what she was underneath all of the machinery of the divorce and the custody battle. She did the right thing once, he said, when it cost her something. During a difficult moment in the custody hearing, she told the truth when it would have been easier not to. Then there's something to work with, Ren said. There's usually something if you look for the right thing. She talked to him for another 40 minutes after that. Not as a victim revisiting old territory, but as a professional who had spent her working life developing expertise in exactly this kind of situation. She described Douglas's methods with the clinical precision of someone who had studied them from the inside and the outside, both who understood how predatory behavior operated within the specific ecosystem of family trust. She was not going to solve this for him. She was clear about that in a way that Grady respected. Grady Mercer was going to have to walk into whatever came next on his own feet and with his own voice, but she would give him the words his own understanding lacked. She would give him the framework that made the pattern legible to people who hadn't lived inside it. When she hung up, Grady sat in the kitchen for a long time. Owen was asleep or close to it, the light under his door reduced to the faint glow of a phone screen, rather than the brighter light of someone still awake and working. Grady looked at the ceiling through it, toward the hidden room above, where Ren Pruitt had spent her nights with the door locked from the inside and the world locked out. Harlan had built that room because he had seen something no one else would acknowledge. He had protected his daughter with the only tools available to him, and the world had called that protection abuse, and it had cost him everything he had. Grady Mercer was not going to make the same mistake. He was not going to build walls in the dark. He was going to speak plainly in daylight in a courtroom with everything Harlan Pruitt had preserved laid out on a table for people with the authority to do something with it. He picked up his pen and turned to a fresh page in his notebook. He had a considerable amount of work to do. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with adrenaline or with the specific clarity that emergencies produce. It arrives quietly in the middle of an ordinary night when a man looks at what he knows and decides that knowing it is no longer sufficient, that something has to be done with it, regardless of the personal cost, regardless of how much easier it would be to stay inside the limit of what he can be certain of, and let the uncertainty decide things by default. Grady Mercer sat at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning with Harlan Pruitt's journal open in front of him and Ren Calloway's voice still present in his memory, and made the decision that would determine the rest of everything. He was going to tell Sylvia the truth, all of it, before the courthouse, before lawyers and motions and a judge who had never met any of them. He was going to sit across from the woman he had been married to for 14 years and give her the chance to see her brother clearly, because if she couldn't, then he would fight that battle in court. But she deserved the chance first. That was the kind of man Harlan Pruitt had tried to be, and the world had broken him for it because he had tried to fight alone, quietly building walls in the dark instead of speaking plainly in the light. Grady intended to speak plainly. He called Sylvia the next morning during his lunch break at Kellerman, sitting in his truck with the engine running for heat, the shop sounds muffled behind the closed windows. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the measured wariness she had developed for conversations with him, the voice of someone who had learned to stay a certain distance from whatever he was about to say. "I need to meet with you," Grady said, "face to face, not on the phone, just the two of us, no lawyers, no Douglas." A pause. Why no Douglas? "Because what I need to tell you is about Douglas, and I need you to hear it before he has the chance to explain it away." Another pause longer. He could hear her breathing, the small sounds of someone deciding. "Is this some kind of legal strategy, Grady? Because the hearing is in 8 days and I don't have time for—" "It's not strategy, it's the truth. And if after you hear it, you still want to proceed with the hearing, then we proceed. I'm not asking you to do anything except listen for an hour." He waited. 14 years, Sylvia. You know me well enough to know when I'm not playing games." The silence stretched long enough that he thought she might simply hang up. Then, Thursday evening, the Millbrook Diner on Route 46, 7 o'clock, and Grady, "This better be real." "It's real," he said, "I promise you." Ren Calloway's statement arrived by email on Wednesday morning. 9 pages single-spaced, written with the precise and measured authority of a professional who understood both the personal history and the clinical framework that gave it meaning. She had written it the way she approached her work, methodically, without sentimentality, with the careful structure of someone who understood that clarity was the most powerful form of argument available to her. She wrote about Douglas Fenn's pattern of behavior across the span of her childhood and afterward, about his methods of access, about the way men with his particular orientation constructed webs of trust within families, weaving themselves into the fabric of ordinary life, so that any accusation became automatically a betrayal of all of everyone who loved them. She wrote about her father, about what he had seen and what he had done and what it had cost him. She wrote one paragraph near the end that Grady read 4 times before he moved on. "My father was not a complicated man. He was a carpenter who fixed things with his hands and loved his family with everything he had. He did not have the language of psychology or the resources of the legal system. What he had was clarity about what he saw happening to his daughter and the willingness to act on that clarity even when everyone around him called it madness. History has not been kind to men like my father. I am asking you to be different." Grady printed all 9 pages at the library in Nashville. He held them in both hands for a moment before sliding them into the folder alongside the copies he had made of Harlan's journal entries and the screenshots he had taken from the VHS tape documentation. He drove to the diner on Thursday evening with the folder on the passenger seat and the particular internal steadiness of a man who has already accepted what the next several days might cost him and decided to proceed regardless. Sylvia was already there when he arrived. She sat in a corner booth away from the windows, dressed in the careful professional attire she wore when she wanted the armor of competence around her. She had a coffee she wasn't drinking. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, the tiredness of someone who has been managing too many things for too long. Grady sat down across from her. He did not order anything. He put the folder on the table and slid it toward her. Read it before you say anything. All of it. Take as long as you need. She looked at the folder, then at him. Something in his face, in the absence of the usual tension between them, made her open it without arguing. He watched her read. He had seen Sylvia in many conditions over 14 years. Angry and afraid and triumphant and defeated. He had seen her on the night Owen was born, when everything complicated between them fell away, and there was only the two of them and this new person they had made, and nothing else had mattered at all. He watched her face now, with the diagnostician's attention reading every small change in the set of her jaw and the position of her hands. The skepticism lasted through the first 2 pages. He could see it in the deliberate neutrality of her expression, the controlled face of someone who has decided in advance not to be moved by whatever they're about to encounter. Then something shifted. Subtle, a tightening around her eyes that was not skepticism. Her hand that had been resting flat on the table curled slightly at the fingers. She turned a page without looking up, and then another. She read for 22 minutes, he counted. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked out the window at the parking lot for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, the way you look when you're not seeing what's in front of you. Then she looked at Grady. These are from the people who owned your house. Harlan and Lorraine Pruitt, their daughter Wren. The statement at the end is from Wren herself. She's 37 now. She's a trauma counselor in Portland. Sylvia looked at the folder. This doesn't prove anything specific. No, Grady agreed. It doesn't. There was never enough for criminal charges. There still isn't. But read the pattern, Sylvia, not the individual incidents. The pattern over time. She looked down at the pages again. He waited. He encouraged me to fight you for full custody, she said slowly in the tone of someone testing a thought against the air. Before the divorce was even finalized. He said you were unstable, that Owen needed real stability, that a man who spent his life under cars couldn't provide what a growing boy needed. She paused. I thought he was being protective of me, supporting me through something hard. Did you really think that? Her eyes came up. Grady kept his voice even. He was not here to win an argument. He was here for the same reason Harlan Pruitt had spent his savings on soundproofing and concealed hinges and 3 nights of repainting clouds on a ceiling until they looked exactly right. For the child. Only for the child. I need to ask you something, Grady said, and I need an honest answer. Not for me, for Owen. He looked at her steadily. Has Douglas ever asked to be alone with him? Specifically requested time that was just the two of them, without other adults present? Sylvia's face did something complicated that moved through several expressions without settling on any one of them. He watched it happen. The memory surfacing, the specific memory of a specific moment that had been stored as innocuous and was now being retrieved in a different light, with different context around it, and was no longer innocuous. Last summer, she said. Her voice had changed quieter, the professional armor showing its first crack. He wanted to take Owen fishing, just the two of them for a whole weekend, his cabin up near Terre Haute. What did you say? I said no, Owen had plans. She stopped. Her hand on the table was completely still. But that wasn't really why I said no. Why did you say no, Sylvia? She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table rather than at him, because something felt wrong about how he asked. The way he kept coming back to the fact that it would just be them. Too focused on making sure no one else would be there. Too eager in a way that I couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. She looked up. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that he was trying to bond with his nephew, that I was being unfair to him after everything he'd done for me. You weren't being ridiculous. Her jaw tightened. She picked up the last page of Wren's statement and read a single paragraph again, then set it down very carefully as if it were something that required gentle handling. He's my brother, she said. He's been in my life my entire life. When things fell apart between us, he was there every day. He helped me with the legal costs. He sat with me through the worst of it. She looked up. How do I know this isn't what he'd say it is? You finding some old family tragedy and using it to make me doubt someone I've trusted my whole life. Grady reached into the folder and pulled out a single separate sheet he had printed the day before. The obituary of Harlan Pruitt with Wren's name in it, and beside it a screenshot of Ren Calloway's professional website, her photograph, her credentials, her contact information displayed with the transparency of someone who has nothing to hide. "Call her," he said, "right now if you want. Her number's on the website. Call her and ask her yourself whether what's in that statement is true. Ask her what her father was protecting her from. Ask her about Douglas." He slid the sheet across the table. "I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to make one phone call to one person who has no stake in our situation." Sylvia looked at the photograph of Ren Calloway on the printed page. A woman in her late 30s with careful eyes and the composure of someone who has made peace with difficult things without pretending they didn't happen. She picked up her phone. She stepped outside. Through the diner window, Grady could see her standing in the parking lot under the yellow light of the overhead lamp, one hand pressed flat against her sternum, in an unconscious gesture of self-steadying, speaking to someone on the phone. He could not hear the words. He didn't need to. She was outside for 18 minutes. When she came back in and sat down, she didn't speak for almost a full minute. Grady waited because some things required the time they required, and rushing them only made them worse. "She told me something not in the statement," Sylvia said finally. Her voice had changed again, quieter still, with something fragile in it. "She said Douglas came to her father's funeral. In 2018, Harlan Pruitt, the man whose family Douglas destroyed. He came to the funeral and stood at the back of the room, and when Ren saw him, he nodded at her." She stopped, like he was acknowledging something, like he'd won something and wanted her to know he knew it. Her voice was barely above a conversation now. "She said she's never forgotten the way he nodded at her." Grady said nothing. "He helped me pay for the custody lawyers," Sylvia said. "I thought it was because he loved Owen, because that's what family does." She looked at Grady, and what was in her face now was not the professional composure of the woman who had sat down 20 minutes ago. It was something more fundamental than that, the expression of someone who has discovered that a wall they had been leaning against for years is not a wall at all. He was paying to remove you. That's what he was actually doing. Yes. Her hand came up and covered her mouth for a moment, then dropped. "Owen. Owen is safe. He's been careful around Douglas without fully understanding why, which tells you something about the instincts you gave him." Grady leaned forward slightly. "But Douglas filed his own petition, Sylvia, independent of yours, with his own legal standing as a concerned family member. Even if you withdraw your motion, the hearing proceeds. He anticipated you might change your mind." She looked at him sharply. "Then what do we do?" It was the first time in 14 months she had used "we" with that particular meaning, the meaning of two people on the same side of something. "We go to that courtroom," Grady said, "and we tell the truth. All of it. Together." Sylvia called her lawyer from the diner parking lot and instructed him to file a withdrawal of her custody motion. The lawyer argued, outlined the strength of the case, expressed professional reluctance at abandoning a strategy he had invested considerable time in. She was firm in the way Grady had always respected, even when it was directed against him. She hung up and stood in the cold for a moment, just standing with the particular stillness of someone absorbing the full weight of a decision. Then she called Owen. Grady could hear her side of it from 6 feet away. Her voice was measured and careful, the specific tone of a mother managing her own distress so it doesn't transfer to the person she's calling. She told Owen she loved him. She told him she was working something out. She asked him to trust her. Owen, from whatever he said in response, apparently asked no questions. He already knew, Grady thought. 16 years old, and he already understood more than either of his parents had wanted him to have to understand. Douglas Fenn arrived at the Brown County Courthouse on a Monday morning in November, looking like every good thing a person is supposed to trust. His suit was charcoal gray and impeccably fitted. His silver hair was trimmed with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was a language and had spent years becoming fluent in it. His handshake with the bailiff was warm. His voice when he spoke to the clerk about a minor administrative matter was the voice of a man who belonged everywhere he went and had never had reason to doubt it. Grady watched him from across the lobby and felt something cold and specific settle into his chest. Not fear, something more useful than fear. The absolute clarity of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at and has names for all of its parts. Judge Elaine Rourke presided. She was 61 years old with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore pushed down her nose when she was listening, and up her nose when she was thinking about what she'd heard. She had the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting when something was not what it claimed to be. The clerk read the case into the record. Douglas Fenn's petition for welfare investigation of Owen Mercer Minor, currently residing with Raymond Gerald Mercer. Douglas rose. He presented his case with the smooth efficiency of a man who had prepared extensively and had complete confidence in his own performance, the confidence that comes from having done this particular kind of thing successfully many times before. He laid out the facts as facts without obvious distortion, letting their arrangement do the persuasive work. The condemned property purchased with a man's last $500, the hidden room with its documented child welfare history, the historical CPS intervention, a father's questionable judgment pattern, a child deserving stability that his current circumstances didn't provide. He was good. Grady had known he would be good. The man had been performing this specific role in various contexts for his entire adult life. When Douglas finished, Judge Rourke turned to Grady. "Mr. Mercer, the petitioner has described a hidden room on your property with a documented child welfare history. I'd like you to explain that room, why it exists, what you know about it, and why you've made the decision to preserve it rather than remove it." Grady stood. He did not have a lawyer's rhetorical training or a performer's instincts for an audience. What he had was 17 years of explaining complicated mechanical failures to people who didn't have the technical vocabulary to follow the explanation, and the skill he had developed over those years of finding the plainest, clearest, most honest way to describe exactly what had happened and why in language that anyone paying attention could follow. He told Judge Rourke about Harlan Pruitt. He told it the way Harlan himself would have told it, in plain declarative sentences without embellishment, because Harlan had been a man who believed that the plain truth was sufficient and that anything added to it was decoration that served the teller rather than the truth. A man, a daughter he had adopted and loved, a threat he had identified that no one else in his life would acknowledge, a father doing the only thing he could think of when the systems that were supposed to protect children were not available to him from where he stood. He presented the journals, the letters, the VHS tape documentation. He laid each piece on the table like a man laying out tools before a job, everyone in its proper place, each one doing the specific work it was built to do. Douglas interjected twice. Hearsay. A troubled man's delusions from 25 years ago, documented by the man himself, and therefore not independent evidence of anything. The judge allowed both objections, noted them, and continued listening to Grady. When Grady finished, the courtroom held a specific quality of silence. Judge Rourke looked at the documentation for a long moment. Then she looked at Douglas. "Mr. Fenn, you worked in Child Protective Services in Indiana in the mid-1990s. Is that correct?" Douglas's posture remained perfect. "I was a caseworker for approximately 3 years before I completed my accounting degree, an early career position. And during that time, you had access to adoption case files. As part of my professional duties, yes, including the file of Ren Pruitt, who was placed with the Pruitt family through your agency in 1993. A fraction of a pause, almost undetectable. I processed a large number of cases during that period. I couldn't speak to any specific file without reviewing records. In December of 1999, someone made an anonymous report to Brown County Child Protective Services about the Pruitt household. That report initiated the welfare check that resulted in the discovery of the hidden room and the subsequent removal of Ren Pruitt from her family home. Judge Rourke removed her glasses and set them on the bench, which Grady had noticed she only did when she wanted to see something without the mediation of glass between her eyes and it. "Were you that anonymous reporter, Mr. Fenn?" The courtroom was absolutely still. Douglas Fenn's expression did not change, but he was a full 2 seconds answering, and in a courtroom, 2 seconds was a geological age, enough time for everyone present to notice the space where an immediate answer should have been. "That's a serious accusation without any evidentiary basis, Your Honor. It's a question, Mr. Fenn, not an accusation. I don't recall making any such report." "Don't recall," Grady noted. "Not I didn't. Not that never happened. Don't recall." Judge Rourke put her glasses back on. She looked at Sylvia, who had been sitting in the gallery with the stillness of someone who has decided something and is waiting for the moment to act on it. Miss Mercer, you requested to make a voluntary statement. Sylvia stood. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the composure of a woman who has made a decision and has made her peace with what it will cost. She stood without fidgeting, without looking at her brother, and spoke directly to the judge. She told the truth about Douglas encouraging the custody fight from before the divorce was finalized. She told it accurately and without exaggeration, which made it more powerful than any dramatized version could have been, because it sounded exactly like what it was a woman reporting what had happened. She told the judge about the fishing trip and the specific quality of eagerness that had accompanied the invitation. She told the judge about the feeling she had dismissed as overreaction and now understood differently. She told the judge that she had spoken with Wren Calloway by phone and that what Wren had told her was consistent with everything in the documented record. I believed my brother because I had no reason to question him, Sylvia said. I understand now that his goal was to remove Owen's father from his life and establish himself as the trusted adult male presence in its place. I was the mechanism for accomplishing that. I didn't see it while it was happening. She paused. I see it now. Douglas turned in his seat. His voice dropped to something that sounded for the first time like an appeal rather than a performance. The voice of someone who has felt the ground shift and is reaching for something to hold. Sylvia, think about what you're doing. Think about what this means for our family. Sylvia looked at him then, directly, for the first time since she had stood up. I am thinking about our family, she said. That's exactly what I'm doing. She turned back to the judge and did not look at him again. Owen was called. He walked to the front of the courtroom looking younger than his 16 years, in his button-down shirt and pressed khakis, a boy dressed carefully for a serious occasion, carrying the formal clothes with the slight discomfort of someone not yet entirely at home in them. He sat in the witness chair with his hands on his knees and looked at the judge with the steady, dark eyes that were his mother's eyes and were, Grady was increasingly understanding now, entirely his own. Judge Rourke spoke to him with the careful directness of someone who respected teenagers enough not to condescend to them. She asked about living with his father. Owen answered honestly, acknowledging the hard beginning without dwelling on it, the cold first weeks, and the camping pads, in the house that required everything from both of them, and then describing what the house had become through that effort. A real home, a place where he had learned to do things with his hands and understood the connection between work and result. A place with space enough to think. Then the judge asked about Douglas. Owen's answer was unhurried. He described the pattern without calling it a pattern, letting the accumulated details speak for itself. The questions about his schedule, the specific interest in when he was home alone, the text, the fishing invitation that his mother had declined and that he had been privately relieved about without knowing why. The quality of attention Douglas paid at family gatherings, watchful in a way that was different from ordinary interest. I always made sure I wasn't alone with him, Owen said. I don't know exactly when I started doing that. It became a habit before it was a decision. Were you ever frightened of him specifically? Not frightened exactly, Owen said. It's more like this. When something is about to go wrong with an engine before it actually fails, there's a sound, real subtle. Most people never hear it. But if you've been around engines long enough, you start hearing it and you understand what it means. He glanced at his father briefly, then back to the judge. I learned to hear that sound from my dad. Douglas makes that sound. Judge Rourke was quiet for a moment. She thanked Owen and told him he could sit down. She spent 4 minutes reviewing the documentation Grady had submitted, reading with the attention of someone who intended to use what she was reading. The courtroom waited in the particular silence of people who understand that something consequential is being decided. When Judge Rourke looked up, she addressed Douglas Fenn directly. Mr. Fenn, I am dismissing your petition. Douglas began to rise. Your Honor, the welfare of a minor child. Sit down, Mr. Fenn. He sat. I have before me documentation of a pattern of behavior that, while not constituting criminal proof in the legal sense, is sufficiently consistent and sufficiently concerning to warrant action by this court in the exercise of its responsibility to protect children. Owen Mercer is clearly safe and well cared for in his father's custody. The property in question, whatever its condition at the time of purchase, has been substantially improved and represents, by all evidence, a suitable and stable home for a teenage boy. She paused. What is not suitable based on the totality of what I have heard today is your proximity to this child. She set down her pen with the finality of a decision already made. I am issuing an order prohibiting contact between Douglas Fenn and Owen Mercer, supervised or otherwise effective immediately and until further order of this court. I am also referring this matter to the Indiana Attorney General's office for review of the historical record regarding the Pruitt family and any other cases with which Mr. Fenn may have been associated during his time in Child Protective Services. The silence in the courtroom had a specific quality, now the silence of something ending. Mr. Mercer, Judge Rourke said, looking at Grady with the direct attention she had given to everything throughout the hearing. Continue being the father your son clearly needs. She gathered her papers with the efficiency of someone moving into the next thing. This hearing is concluded. Outside the courthouse, the November air came at them like cold water, clean and immediate, the specific sharpness of Indiana in late autumn after the closed and pressurized atmosphere of the courtroom. Grady stood on the steps with Owen beside him and Sylvia a few feet away, all three of them in the particular quiet of people who have just come through something large and haven't yet established the distance to see its shape. Douglas left without speaking to any of them. He walked to his car with his folder under his arm and his silver hair undisturbed, the performance maintaining itself through the final exit with the discipline of someone who has been performing for so long that the performance and the person have become the same thing. He got in his car and drove away. Sylvia stood on the courthouse steps and looked at Grady with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in a long time, the expression that preceded it, the usual distance of the divorce and all of its machinery. Something more honest than what had become normal between them. Recognition of a person she had known before all of this began. He's been doing this his whole life, she said. That's what Wren told me. His whole life, and he has never once been stopped. He's stopped now, Grady said. Is that enough? Grady thought about Harlan Pruitt, about a man who had built a room with his own hands to protect his daughter and had died in 2018 believing he had failed, whose daughter had stood at his graveside and watched the man who destroyed their family nod at her across the room like a victor. It's a start. The AG's office will look at other cases. Wren said there was at least one other family she was aware of. When you remove someone's protective coloring, other things become visible. Sylvia nodded slowly. She pulled her coat closer against the cold. The house, she said. Can I come see it? What you've done with it? Any time, Owen said from Grady's other side. We're always working on something. She left after that, walking to her car with the look of a woman who has a great deal to think about and has accepted that the thinking is now the work, the most important work she has ahead of her. Grady and Owen stood on the courthouse steps until her taillights disappeared around the corner and the sound of her engine faded. Is it over? Owen asked. The legal part, yes. But not Douglas. People like Douglas don't stop unless they're fully stopped. The investigation will take time. But he can't access you. He can't access anyone in your life. That protective coloring is gone. Grady looked at his son, and that matters more than anything else right now. Owen nodded. He looked up at the gray November sky for a moment, at the flat lid of clouds that winter brings to Indiana, the sky of a landscape preparing itself. Then can we go home, home? The word arrived simply, without any of the weight or negotiation it had carried 6 weeks ago, as if it had finally settled into meaning one specific place. Yeah, Grady said. Let's go home. Spring came to Brown County the way it always does in Indiana, not as a declaration, but as an accumulation of small evidences. A day in early March that was warmer than it had any right to be. Then a week of cold that felt like winter reasserting itself. Then something that shifted in the quality of the light in late March and didn't shift back. By April, the woods surrounding 2,241 Harlow Creek Road had committed to green with the sudden conviction of a landscape that has made up its mind, and wildflowers had claimed the field between the tree line and the barn in colors that Grady would not have been able to name and didn't need to. The house wore fresh white paint, not the perfect white of new construction, but the honest white of a structure that had been attended to by hands that knew what they were doing and cared about the result. The porch stood straight and level. Its boards replaced 2 wooden rocking chairs positioned to catch the evening light from the west. The windows caught the April sky and held pieces of it. The ivy was gone from the right side of the structure, removed one length at a time over 3 weekends, In February, the original clapboard beneath it in better condition than anyone had expected the wood sound under the years of coverage. The barn still lean. That was next year's project already discussed and planned. But Grady had stabilized its worst structural failures through the winter, and inside it, along one wall, he had built a workbench that could have been described as overbuilt if you didn't understand that some things were worth doing beyond the minimum. Ren Calloway's rental car came down Harlow Creek Road at 9:30 on a Saturday morning in April. Grady was on the porch with his first cup of coffee when he heard the tires on the gravel. He watched her car come through the tree tunnel and into the clearing and come to a stop. She sat inside for a moment before getting out, and he understood that without needing to have it explained. He stayed on the porch. He let her look at the house on her own terms for as long as she needed to look. She was 37 years old. She had her father's build compact and deliberate, and she moved with the quality of someone who has learned that their body is a reliable thing, that it will do what they ask of it. Her hair was cut to her shoulders. She wore a field jacket the color of deep pine. She stood in the clearing, looking at the house with an expression that Grady couldn't read from the porch. Distance, and understood, was probably not meant for him. Then she looked at him. He raised his coffee cup. She almost smiled, which was something. Owen came out through the front door behind Grady, sleep-creased and carrying his own cup with the morning inattention of a teenager not yet fully operational, and the three of them stood on the straight porch of the restored house in the April morning, while the woods around them made their slow spring sounds. "It's different," Ren said. "Better, I hope." "Yes." She looked at the fresh paint, the new windows, the rocking chairs. "Better." A pause. "But still itself, I can see what it was under what it is now, the shape of it. Does that make sense?" "It does," Grady said. They showed her the house, the living room with its restored fireplace, the mantel cleaned and leveled the brick, relayed where water had worked into the mortar over years. The kitchen that functioned completely now, with a stove and a refrigerator and cabinets, Grady had refinished one door at a time over the winter evenings. The dining room, where the built-in shelves had been cleaned and oiled and now held books and the accumulated small objects of a household in use. Owen showed her his room with the quiet pride of someone showing a stranger something personal without pretending it wasn't personal. Ren stood in the doorway and looked at the desk and the books and the engineering textbook prominent on the shelf and the evidence of a life being genuinely lived in the space. "Your father's drawing is still here," Owen said, nodding toward the crayon sketch still pinned to the wall. "My home, June 1994. Ren looked at it for a long moment, and something moved through her expression. "He did that the first week we moved in," she said. "He thought I had done it. I let him think that. He was so pleased with whoever had done it." She touched the edge of the paper. "He would have been glad to know it's still there." They went upstairs. In the bedroom with the floral wallpaper, Grady pressed the concealed release, and the door swung inward with the same smooth silence it had always offered, the quality of Harlan's craftsmanship intact after everything. The hidden room opened before them, the yellow walls and the hand-painted clouds and the 100 drawings in their careful rows, all of it exactly as it had been. Ren stepped through the doorway and stood in her father's room and did not speak for a long time. Grady and Owen stayed in the doorway. They understood without discussing it that this moment belonged to her, and that their role was simply to have made it possible to have found the room and kept it and brought her back to it. She moved slowly around the space. She touched the walls, running her fingertips along the painted surface, the way you touch something you want to remember through your hands as well as your eyes. She ran her fingers across the spines of the books on the shelves, stopping at Anne of Green Gables, pulling it slightly out from the shelf, and finding the bookmark still in place at chapter 12, exactly where she had left it on the night of December 3rd, 1999, the night they had found the room and made her come out of it. She held the book for a moment, then pushed it gently back into its place. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the drawings on the walls, at the progression of them, the early cheerfulness giving way to darker colors, and then one drawing near the end of the series, dated November 1999, that showed something different from the others. A girl small standing in a yellow room. Outside the room, dense and complete black. But inside the room with the girl, a single yellow sun, bright and particular, and hers alone, safe inside the dark. "He built this for me in 11 months, Ren said, working every night after I went to bed. He bought the materials a little at a time, so that no single purchase would look unusual to anyone who might be paying attention. He sourced the soundproofing from a contractor 2 counties over, so no one local would ask questions about what it was for. She looked up at the ceiling clouds. He painted those freehand. It took him 3 nights to get them right. He kept painting over them and starting over until they looked the way he wanted. He didn't show me until they were exactly what he had in mind. She stood and went to the toy chest. She lifted the false bottom herself with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where the mechanism is and looked at the empty space beneath. Grady had returned the journals to her by mail in January. Harlan's and Wren's both everything except the Polaroid, which she had specifically asked him to keep. She had brought something with her. A letter in a sealed envelope, which she placed in the empty compartment and covered with the false bottom, pressing it closed with both hands. "For whoever finds this next," she said, "if anyone does, so the story doesn't have to begin from nothing again." Then Grady held out the music box. He had kept it on the mantel in the living room through the winter beside the 2 photographs because it felt wrong to put it away and wrong to use it without her present. He had not wound it since the night he and Owen had found it. He held it out to Wren, now with both hands, the way you offer something that has been held in trust. She took it with the recognition that bypasses ceremony, the particular way you receive something that has always been yours. She turned it over and read the engraving on the base. "For Wren love always Grandma Jean." She held it for a moment with both hands not moving. Then she wound the key. The mechanism engaged and the small clear notes of the lullaby filled the hidden room, precise and delicate, exactly as they had sounded to a frightened girl on 100 nights when the world outside the yellow walls was too large and too uncertain and too dangerous to face without the certainty that this room existed and that the door locked from the inside. The music was not sad. That was the thing about it that struck Grady. It was simply itself, small and true and persistent, filling the space without apology. Owen, standing in the doorway, went very still. Grady looked at his son and felt something that did not have a simple name. The full weight of the last 6 months arriving all at once, or not arriving, but simply being felt the way things that have been carried for a long time can suddenly be felt in their entirety when you finally set them down. The $500 in the condemned house and the camping pads on the living room floor. The drive to the library and the old man in the general store, and the letter behind the baseboard and the door that clicked open in the bedroom wall. The 2 journals and the VHS tape and the phone call from Portland and the 9-page statement in the diner booth and Sylvia stepping outside to make a call she couldn't have made 6 weeks before. The courtroom and Owen in the witness chair describing the sound an engine makes before it fails. All of it arriving here in this room, in this music. The mechanism wound down slowly, the notes spacing themselves further apart, each one landing in more silence than the one before, until the last note sounded and held and faded, and the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something has just finished that was worth listening to. Wren closed the music box. She held it against her chest for a moment, both hands around it. Then she carefully placed it in the pocket of her field jacket, where it settled against her side with the weight of something that had found where it belonged. "Thank you," she said, to Grady, to Owen, to the room itself, or to what the room represented, or to her father who had built it and was not there to hear it. "Thank your father," Grady said. "He kept the truth alive long enough for it to matter." They walked her to her car at noon. The April air was warm enough to be comfortable in a light jacket, and the clearing was bright with the kind of late morning light that makes things look like they mean something, though Grady had learned to be careful about that particular quality of light and what he assigned to it. Wren stood beside the rental and looked at the house one more time, the complete and careful look of someone taking a photograph in their memory. "Take care of it," she said. "We will." She looked at Owen. "Your dad told me you were thinking about engineering." "Still thinking about it, leaning toward it." "Your grandfather would have appreciated that." She smiled, and for a moment the girl from the drawings was visible in the woman's face, the girl who had drawn a yellow sun inside a black room. He believed in building things, in making things that last beyond the people who made them. She opened the car door. "You've got good material to work with, both of you." She drove down the tree tunnel and was gone. Grady and Owen stood in the clearing until the sound of the engine faded completely into the spring woods, And for a moment after that, until the woods had returned fully to their own sounds and the clearing had settled back into the particular quality of stillness it held in the middle of an April morning, they went back inside. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun went down behind the tree line, painting the sky in the colors that Indiana produces in the hour before dark, deep orange, fading through gold to the particular blue that arrives just before the stars become visible. A sequence that happened every evening and was worth watching every time. Owen had his feet up on the porch railing, which Grady had mentioned 3 times was inadvisable, given that the finish was still curing, and Owen had calculated correctly that the cost of the transgression was minimal compared to the comfort of the position. Grady let it go. On the mantel inside 2 photographs in simple wooden frames, Harlan and Lorraine and Wren in the summer of 1994 standing before a house they had just made their own, all 3 of them squinting into the sun that was behind the camera, Harlan's arm around his daughter's shoulders, Wren's front teeth missing in a grin that had no reservations in it. And beside it, taken by Sylvia on the courthouse steps in November, with her phone, Grady and Owen in their court clothes looking tired and real, Owen's head now slightly above his father's because the boy had kept growing. Between the 2 photographs, the Polaroid, Harlan, Lorraine, Wren, first summer in our dream house. The words on the back, we made it. We're actually happy. Beside the Polaroid, Wren's composition notebook closed its cover worn and soft. Inside it, a girl's handwriting moving from cheerful to frightened and back again to something that had no single word. Not cheerful, not frightened, present, surviving. Here. The music box was gone, now carried away in the pocket of a field jacket the color of pine trees back to Portland, where it had always belonged. The space where it had sat was not empty. It was simply space available for whatever came next. Owen broke the evening quiet without preamble, the way he had been doing lately, as if the silence between them had become safe enough to speak into without preparation. I've been thinking about the barn. What about it? If we took the collapsed section all the way down and rebuilt it from scratch, we could use the space for something actual. Workshop, maybe. You could keep project cars out of the weather. I could have room to work on whatever I end up working on. He paused. It would be something we built. Not restored, not repaired. Built from the ground up. Ours. Grady looked out at the darkening tree line. The barn was visible at the edge of the clearing, its asymmetric silhouette against the sky, still leaning, still working through its issues at the pace these old structures chose, held in place by the work they'd done through the winter. That's a summer's worth of work, he said. I've got a summer. Grady was quiet for a moment, thinking about Harlan Pruitt buying materials a little at a time from a contractor, 2 counties over, working every night after his daughter was asleep, painting clouds on a ceiling until they looked exactly right. Building something because someone he loved needed it to exist, because love sometimes expressed itself most completely through the patient construction of specific material things. Okay, he said, we'll start in June. Owen nodded and, without being reminded, put his feet down from the railing. He picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands, looking at something in the middle distance that was probably the barn, or possibly nothing, the kind of looking that accompanies thinking. Dad? Yeah. I'm glad you spent that $500. Grady looked through the window at the Polaroid on the mantel. At the man in the work clothes with his arm around his daughter, standing in front of a house they had chosen to believe in on a summer day in 1994, when believing in it was the most reasonable thing in the world, and the future was simply the future unwritten possible. Me too, kid, he said. Me too. The house settled around them in the evening cool, making its old sounds. The language of wood and plaster and time, the specific vocabulary of a structure that has been standing long enough to have a voice. In the hidden room upstairs, Wren's drawings covered the yellow walls in the dark, and her letter waited in the false bottom of the toy chest for whoever might find it next. And the white clouds her father had painted on the ceiling floated in place the way they always had. Patient, quiet. There. Some rooms are more than rooms. Some houses remember what happened in them and hold that memory, the way old wood holds warmth, releasing it slowly over years to whoever is present and paying attention. In some stories, the ones built from love and desperation and the absolute refusal to abandon someone who needs you find their way forward through time in ways their authors never imagined, reaching people they never knew, protecting children they never met. Harlan Pruitt had built a room to protect his daughter. He had died in 2018 believing it had cost him everything, that the thing he had done out of love had been the mechanism of his family's destruction. What it had actually done was wait. Through 23 years of silence and seasons and the slow patient work of decay, it had waited for the right moment to matter again. For a man with $500 and nowhere else to put them. For a boy learning to trust the sound that warned him something was about to go wrong. For a woman who had spent her working life turning the worst thing that had ever happened to her into the most useful thing she had to offer. For all the people who needed the story that had been living quietly in those walls. The porch light came on automatically as full dark settled over the clearing, casting its warm circle over the two rocking chairs and the straight boards and the front door with its new hardware that worked exactly as hardware should. Inside the house, the light was on in the kitchen. Someone was home.